Welcome everyone to the 20th International Literature Festival in Berlin. I'm super thrilled to see you all here after month and month of being at home and doing homeschooling and not meeting many people. I'm super happy that the Literature Festival can take place in person this year. And yeah, thank you for everyone who made that happen. It's great. And I know that many schools from Berlin are here today. I heard of the Heinrich Schliemann School, Händel Gymnasium, Katholische Schule, St. Francisco Schule, Schiller Gymnasium, Lessing Gymnasium, I think among others. Welcome everyone. It's great you all are here. My name is Ada and I'm the host today. And before I will introduce Sally Nichols to you and we hear her speech, her opening speech, I would like to remind you all that you put all your mobile devices in flight mode so we don't get interrupted by any calls or important messages, please. And then again, after being online for months and months, maybe that's even something to embrace and focus here. Also, please note that no photos or audio or video recordings are permitted, so not permitted. Please don't record anything or do photos. Thank you. Also, before we start, I would like to thank all sponsors who made the festival happen again, now since 20 years, which is amazing. One of the main sponsors is the Hauptstadt Kulturfonds and das Auswärtige Amt, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Bundesministerium für Bildung und Forschung, the Ministry for Education and Research, among many, many others. So thank you very much to make this happen and have the festival running. Now, Sally Nichols said she always knew she is a writer, not only that she became one, but she is a writer. She felt that during her childhood and teenage year, and she even says on her webpage that she tried to make her real life feel like it would be a book, and we may ask her later how that worked. But then knowing this and living in a world of books and stories and loving it so much, she had to find a way to make her passion into profession. So born 1983, she grew up in England in Stockton-on-Tees, if I pronounce that correctly. She went to school there, and then before starting with her profession, she traveled the world as far as Australia, New Zealand, and working in Japan. And then returned to England and studied literature and philosophy in Warwick University, and then went to a special master program in Bath Spa University, and that was writing for young people. So she got right into what she wanted to do, picking studies that let her write a novel, and she did. Already during her studies, she wrote this novel, Ways to Live Forever. Maybe some of you know the novel. And that became really famous, was even made into a film, and she got many awards for the book. For example, the Waterstone Children's Book of the Year, and again, Glenn Dimplick's New Writers Award. And in 2008, she even got an award in Germany, the Lux von der Zeit, the Lux of the Year it was, and also she was nominated for the Youth Literature Award in Germany, the Deutsche Jugendliteraturpreis. So many, many awards, but she kept writing, more than 11 books. One other book she wrote is Island of Our Own, or Seasons of Secrets, All Fall Down, among others. She also wrote many short stories. And the latest book she wrote, and is not translated yet into German, although many of her books are translated. We talked about that before. More than 20 languages, books of hers are translated, but the last one was published in 2017 in Anderson Press in London, and it's called Things a Bright Girl Can Do. And I reckon some of you have read the book or parts of the book. May that be true? Yes, some nodding here, that's great. So we come to questions and parts of that later. And this book is focusing on the suffragette movement between 1914 and 1918 in England. So women, young women, girls sometimes, looking for opportunities to get the vote, to get engaged into this movement. And some of you know contemporary movements, of course, like Me Too or women's marches. And at that time, that was already in full swing. So we look into this book later, and we will mainly talk about this. But today, Sally will start and open the festival with a speech which is called Writing in a Pandemic. And please help me to welcome Sally Nichols here on stage with a warm round of applause. Welcome, Sally Nichols.
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. When I said yes to this invitation back in early March, the world was a very different place. For a while, I wasn't even sure I was going to make it here in person. I'm delighted it all worked out, and today I'd like to talk about something which has been a real personal struggle for me over the last couple of months. What is the role of a writer in a time of social upheaval? How do you write in the middle of a global pandemic? I mean this question both practically, how do you do it, and creatively. How will all of you talented people here today take this experience and turn it into art? And how should you do so? What responsibilities do we all have as writers, and for me particularly, as a writer for young people? Virginia Woolf famously said that in order to write, a woman needed money and a room of her own. In 2020, I still have both of those things, though many writers, particularly those whose income is derived from performance and teaching, do not. But I would like, if I may, to add to Ms. Woolf's coda. In order to write in a pandemic, a woman needs money and a room of her own, a clear mental space to think, nothing urgent that needs arranging, longer than 2 hours at a time to work, a quiet house with nobody shouting, "Mummy!" The ability to make herself a cup of coffee without being tackle-hugged by 2 small children. And am I sounding bitter? I am bitter. When Britain entered lockdown in March, my husband and I were living in a tiny 2-bedroom house with a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. My husband's work were understanding about the situation, and we divided the day into 2.5-hour-long chunks. One of us would work, and the other would educate and entertain the children. Every 2.5 hours, we would swap. I am fortunate to have a husband who is a practical feminist. A study by the Office of National Statistics in Britain found that women, on average, were doing 50% more childcare in lockdown than men. Take note, girls, am I a feminist? Our schedule seemed like a good idea in theory, but in practice, it was death to creativity. Some writers worked to coffee shop noises. I worked to a soundtrack of "Mummy!" and "He took my car!" and "Wah!" and the occasional "For God's sake, everybody stop screaming!" Sometimes it was me who did the screaming. Even when they went out, it took most of my working time to get my head out of parent mode and into writing mode. I was usually just beginning to get into something when my shift ended and I was back on junk modelling and dishwasher loading duty. When my children's school and nursery finally opened in June, I was dazzled by the difference those empty 6 hours a day made. I rewrote a 20,000-word novel in 5 weeks. Honestly, it was amazing. But at the beginning of the pandemic, I was trying to claw creative space from a world which was literally screaming for my attention. And while the numbers of the dead and the dying multiplied around me, while everyone online had an urgent and clearly wrong opinion about our governance strategy, I was supposed to be writing a novel for reluctant readers about blogging. I did not care about blogging. None of my readers cared about blogging. The whole book was set in a world which had disappeared, at least temporarily. After a week of staring at my laptop, I made a decision. I could not write this book. But I had to write something, for the sake of my bank balance, my deadlines, my sanity. What do people write about in disasters? In theory, Lockdown should be a gift of a subject for a writer for young people. Children taken out of school and left alone to entertain themselves while their parents work is a classic opening chapter. Get rid of the parents! But of all the agents and publishers I know are wincing somewhat as they brace themselves for an onslaught of picture books about rainbows, children's novels about helping neighbours, and young adult novels about teenagers solving mysteries and fighting crime while the rest of the world is locked down. And do spare a thought for the poor adult agents, facing an inbox of very serious literary novels about lonely middle-aged men finding meaning in isolation. And can you even write meaningfully about something while living through it? Wordsworth famously said that poetry takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. The memoirist and poet Mary Carr wrote that a writer may need to wait 7 or 8 years until after a traumatic event before we understand it enough to write about it. A diary or a piece of journalism, no matter how excellent, is not the same thing as a poet or a novel or a memoir, a poem or a novel or a memoir. One is immediate. The other needs time to emerge. I'm not so sure about this one. It is true that the great novel of the First World War, Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, was not published until 1929. But if Wilfred Owen, who was killed a week before the armistice, had waited until the end of the war to start his war poetry, it would never have been written. Neil Gaiman memorably said that in times of trouble you should make good art. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? I'm trying, Neil! But while this pandemic is a tragedy for many, my personal trauma is mostly domestic and really rather dull. There is not a novel in my attempts to teach number bonds to my son. And getting hold of the last roll of toilet paper in the shop is not the dramatic climax I would have chosen. Do I really want to write about my own life anyway? I'm a novelist. I make stuff up. Writing as therapy is a neat idea, but does it really work in practice? The poet Kate Clancy says that writing about a personal trauma orders the experience it recounts and gives the writer a grip on it. And if they make a good poem out of the truths of their lives, then it is not just control, but power. It is different from being happy. It isn't a cure for anything, but it is profoundly worth having. This is where I segue into the obligatory section on the power of literature, because framing my own experience gives it power. Was lockdown a noble endeavour to save lives and protect our essential workers? Or was it a government hoax to control us and take away our liberties? Does wearing a mask make you a hero or a pussy? Is mask wearing an act of kindness or of anxiety or suppression? Was this pandemic caused by climate change or 3G? Or was it something which the World Health Organization have been telling us to prepare for years? As any psychologist will tell you, the stories we tell have a profound effect on our lived experience. The words we use to name things change them. Plague, pestilence, coronavirus, flu, kung flu, pandemic, cold, hoax. We are living through something remarkable, and the stories we tell about it could literally save lives. I'm not just talking about the great Corona novel, but the stories we tell at the school gate or online when we really ought to be working. Patrick Ness, who opened this festival in 2014, once called writers for young people Pied Pipers, leading children away from the corrupt politicians to strange new lands of opportunity. It's a nice image. Pay your freelancers, people, or we might do the same to you. Perhaps the truth is simply that writers are people, and people are all different. Some of us compose poetry in tranquility. And some of us, like Wendy Cope, do not. In her poem, An Argument with Wordsworth, she wrote, "I have emotion. No one who knows me could fail to detect it. But there's a serious short of tranquility in which to recollect it." So this is my contribution to the theoretical debate. Sometimes poetry is emotion recollected in a highly emotional state. Having cleared away the problem of how to write, I now approach the tricky bit of my speech where I tell you all what you should be writing. And I'm sensing a few hackles rising in the audience already. Don't worry. People often tell writers for young people what we ought to be doing, which would be very helpful if they didn't all disagree with one another. I'm wary of anyone who says books for young people should be anything. I'm sure this doesn't need to be said to anybody in this room, but young adult literature is not a genre. It is sometimes funny, sometimes gritty, sometimes poetical, sometimes fantastical, sometimes speculative, sometimes sad. It is safe and it is highly dangerous. It shows us new worlds and it shows us ourselves. In Britain, our most prestigious award for writing for young people is the Carnegie Medal. It has been given to books about tiny people living under the floorboards, to adventure stories about talking rabbits, and to series that open with pooing dogs and then move sideways into meditations on personal responsibility. That's what great art is. It's multitudinous. As a child, I read everything. Sometimes I wanted something serious, sometimes something silly. Children's books should be as various as children are themselves, and that's as true in times of turmoil as it is in peace. The most popular children's author of the Second World War in Britain was Enid Blyton. She wrote about circuses and ginger beer and fairies and children who camped on islands and foiled smugglers. Her work is about as far removed from the war as you could possibly get. But her novels are a response to the chaos around her, just as much as Carrie's War or When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit are. Carrie's War is a novel about discomfort and uncertainty. Five on a Treasure Island, first published in 1942, is as comforting and undemanding as a soft toy or a pair of slippers. But both speak to a child whose world has been transformed by catastrophic events outside of their control. Both serve a purpose, and both are important. So how did I answer this question as a writer? Well, the first thing I wrote, prosaically, was a picture book about lockdown. It was called Staying Home. It was illustrated magnificently by the German illustrator Vivian Schwartz, and we published it for free on the internet. Then I started a new novel for reluctant readers. This one, a historical story about living with the aftermath of trauma. As I got used to the new normal, I wrote a picture book about oceans and worked my way steadily through my copy edits. A rather boring response, but a very practical one. So much of being a real writer, I hope some of you in this room will discover, is the very mundane things like copy edits and proofreading. I'm not going to write another book about lockdown now. Perhaps I never will. Or perhaps I already am. My next young adult book is another historical novel. It's set in the 1920s, and it's loosely based about the fairy tale Rapunzel. In this story, a girl is locked up in a tower, away from her family and the prince she loved. All alone, she finds her way to freedom, thanks to her singing voice and a rope made of her own hair. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sally. And thank you for giving us right away a little insight into your working routines now during the pandemic and, as a mother at home. I just want to start maybe with asking you what kind of working routines, how it looked like before the pandemic hit, and what you hope to get back to. So how did you come into, or what is your working routine normally when you work on a book, not during the pandemic? How do you work? Where do you write? I think all these little questions around how to be a writer, an author. So tell us a little bit how you normally work.
Yeah, well, in the UK, children start school at 4. So my working routine is from 8:30 when the door shuts behind my husband and my children until about 3 when I go to pick my eldest son up from school. I work in my bedroom with the door shut. Before I had in my own bed, so sort of snuggled up under the duvets. I don't always manage to get my clothes on until about 5 minutes before I have to go and pick my son up from school. Before I had children, I used to work a lot in coffee shops and with friends and things like that. But as an introvert, children are incredibly demanding of your sort of emotional energy, as I think I touched on in the speech. So now writing is my alone time, and I do it as alone as possible. Pre-pandemic, I had an entirely empty house for 6 hours. At the moment, my husband is also working from home, but fortunately, he's a very understanding husband, and in fact, he does a lot of computer programming with his work, so he values his private space as much as I do. And then at 12:30 we get to have lunch together, which is very nice. That's one small perk of the pandemic. And then I go and fetch my children from school. I try and the aim is to write 1,000 words on a good day and 500 words on a bad day. So I'm aiming for 100 words and 1,000 words. And if I write 1,000 words, I will stop and say my work here is done. There have been a few days when that happened sort of before lunch, and it was an amazing vision of what life could be like if I was more organized as a writer. But usually what happens is I'm on about 600 words or something when the school bell rings. But I set up that system before I had children because I would just sit at my computer until I'd got the words written, and it was sort of getting towards midnight or something, and I was still, I'd only written 100 words or something. So I said to myself, if it's a really bad day, you can stop at 500. And actually, you can write 500 words in half an hour if you write quickly enough. So that's always very achievable.
Sounds pretty good. And so you can really immerse yourself into writing, into the ideas and stories you have in your head. And as I said at the beginning, I read that you already had that as a child. So during childhood, you tried to make your life, if I understood that correctly, more like a book. And I would be interested what that means and how much did you read? And when you told people, I want to be a writer, how did, your surroundings react? Was someone like, oh, that's utopian? Or, what do you mean? And did you have to explain that? Or was it obvious to all your family and friends that books and you immersing yourself into these wonderful worlds was your thing?
Yeah, I mean, many writers, I was a huge reader as a child. And I would say to everybody here in this room, I know some of you are young people, you will never get as much time in your life to read as you do when you are a young person. When you have a house and children and a day job and all these other inconvenient things, it's much harder to find that time. So those of you who are interested in writing as a career, I think the single best thing you can do now is to immerse yourself. Well, I always say books, but I mean, if you want to write horror films, then spend your time watching horror films. If you want to be a screenwriter, spend your time watching television programs. If you want to write poems, then go and read poetry. But that time in your youth is when I read the most. I was a huge reader as a child. I talk a little bit about Enid Blyton in my speech. Is Enid Blyton?
Oh yeah, I don't know how it is today. Does anyone know Enid Blyton, Famous Five, Die Fünf Freunde, or other series by her?
Yeah, some people.
Yeah, see, that was big in my childhood as well. I read you like George from the Famous Five.
Oh
didn't you?
yes,
that was my favorite as well.
George is.
Yeah, she was great.
George is the only one who said.
Yeah.
I mean, they're ridiculous books. They are completely ridiculous books, but I love.
But
them.
they're comforting, and you get into the stories, and you get.
She is. Enid Blyton's genius, I think, is to understand what it is that makes children light up. I mean, you know, all those things. They always stayed in a house, and there was always a secret passage that they found, and it always led them somewhere interesting. You know, the number of secret passages those children found, it was ridiculous. And I just loved that as a child, the idea that you could open a door and there would be this secret passageway somewhere. And yeah, so I had George hair, cut my hair. My mother, for some reason, never thought that it was sensible to let, 10-year-old me and my 8-year-old brother camp on islands, which I just thought was ridiculous, because, the Famous Five were allowed to, so why aren't we allowed to? And Arthur Ransom, do you know Arthur Swallows and Amazons? Those books. I'm not sure what's made it into different countries, but he had a similar series about children who had boats and they camped. It was slightly less mad than Enid Blyton, but I was never allowed to, spend all summer camping on an island like the Famous Five did. Swallows and Amazons did either. But yeah, we used to camp in the garden. I had a secret club. I mean, all those sorts of things that people do in books. I was always slightly bitter at the real world that it didn't quite live up to my expectation. And that was one thing. I mean, my books vary in how realistic they are. Some are more fantastical, some are more realistic. But I mean, just little things I remembered as a child. All the characters in Enid Blyton are all called things like Geraldine, and that wasn't the names that children had in my school. So one of the things I do when I'm writing contemporary books is to look at the list of what names are popular and make sure that my children have names that the children will see in the schools around them, because that was something. That was one of the things. I mean, obviously you can't predict what names are going to stay in fashion, and that the names were out of fashion because I was reading books that had been written 50 years ago. But I wanted the children to be able to see some bits of their own lives.
And you did kind of the thing with the new book we want to talk about today, Things a Bright Girl Can Do.
Yeah.
And so you did get the whole context of that time, the historical context, but you also brought in subjects which one may find more in contemporary books today, like sex between two girls in the books, and violent movements or parts of the movement where the suffragettes getting out. So parts that, as you said, wouldn't be in a children's book or in books of the time, but we can bring it in today. And I read this book came to life because your editor had the idea maybe that you get on this subject or write a book that is connected with a subject like that. And I would be interested how you connected then with this idea and how you did research, and what was the important thing for you to write this book?
Yeah, well, the reason I was asked to write this book was I'd written a short story in an anthology about women in the First World War. So it was a lot of stories about nurses and spies and things like that. And I'd written a short story set just after the First World War. I don't know what the statistics were in Germany. I imagine they were probably similar, but in Britain, at the end of the First World War, we had 2 million more women in Britain than we had men. And this was the catalyst for and they were disproportionately young women whose men were fighting age, and they were disproportionately middle and upper class women because they were the husbands who were more likely to be officers. And of course you have the officer at the front of the chart. If you're a gunner or something like that, you're more likely to survive the war. Or if you're working in a coal mine or at a farm or something like that, reserved occupations. So you suddenly had this whole class of women, young women, who'd been educated for marriage, and that had been taken away from them, and they were kind of expected to stay at home and be spinster aunts. And they were this huge catalyst for social change. So many of the firsts for women come in the 1920s and 30s. The first female stockbroker, the first females to own businesses, first female engineer, first female train driver, you know, all those kind of firsts were women sort of saying, well, you know, I don't want to stay at home and be a spinster, and I want to go off and be an archaeologist or something like that. So I wrote a short story about this, and after I'd written it, my editor, who was the same editor as that anthology, invited me for lunch, and she said, you know, you're obviously interested in early feminism. Would you like to write a book about the suffragettes? And I thought for about 2 seconds and went, oh, yes, that sounds amazing. What an interesting concept for a book. And my editor doesn't like synopses. Most editors, they want you to sort of produce a synopsis of the book that you're going to write, but my editor doesn't like that. So we talked a little bit about what the book might be about, and she sort of said, you know, it would be nice to represent all the different voices in the movement, because the suffragette movement, talking about the suffragette movement, and certainly in Britain, I don't know so much about it in Germany, it's a bit like talking about the environmental movement, that you have some people who are out there in the streets, you know, climbing on top of trains and performing direct action. You have some people who are, you know, writing very serious articles in the newspapers and writing books about it and that sort of thing. You have some people who are trying to enact change politically by, you know, the environmental movement. We have the Green Party, or people who are just kind of trying to talk about it in their circle. And it's not one group who are the suffragettes. It's all these little groups, and they all disagree with each other profoundly about the best way to enact change, and they all have very different components. So we talked about kind of representing all of that. And because I didn't have a synopsis, and because I wanted to get it right for this woman who'd asked me to write this book, it became this sort of, I mean, it's not huge in terms of adult books, but it's the longest book I've ever written. It's 90,000 words, and this kind of exploration of some of the different women who are involved in the suffragette movement, and some of the changes that the war made to the suffrage movement, and that sort of thing. And I mean, you're right what you said about writing for contemporary readers. I mean, there are books that were written at the time about being a suffragette. If any of you are interested, so H.G. Wells wrote one called Anne Veronica, which I read, which is about, you know, it's a very similar sort of story to the sort of story a modern writer write about a young girl who decides that she doesn't want to get married and she wants to be a scientist and she's going to go and join the suffragettes, and she tries to break into Buckingham Palace and gets arrested and put in jail and has to go on hunger strike. I mean, it's, you know, it's very similar to the sort of story that a modern writer might tell about it. And you do sort of think, well, why do you need modern readers when these books already exist? But what your job as a historical writer, I think, is to find the parts of history that are still relevant to modern readers, and to find the bits of history that are telling the sort of story that I'm interested in telling. I mean, Anne Veronica ends with her getting married, in fact. I mean, she gets married to somebody very unconventional, who's not at all the sort of person that her father would have wanted her to marry. But she doesn't end up as a scientist. She ends up married. And I don't know that that's necessarily the ending that a modern reader would want in a book. And a lot of the things that I want to talk about are not necessarily the same things that I sort of jokingly like to call this book Little Women with Police Brutality, Trenches and Lesbian Snogging. And I mean, Little Women is a very feminist book, and some of her other work, Six Cousins is another one that she wrote, which is even more feminist in a way. The main character talks about not wanting to get married, and she talks about, am I going to be a doctor, or am I going to be all the women in Little Women have ambitions. It's a book about women who are extremely ambitious and extremely independent. But I have never quite forgiven her for telling Jo that she ought to devote her life to literature, she ought to devote her life to staying at home and looking after her parents, but that it's completely fine for her to get married. It's just not. I mean, I understand the idea that she's saying. The idea is that she is a warm and loving human being, and she should devote her life to people and to loving and to having human connections. You know, Jo is not somebody who necessarily naturally would find human connections for herself, but I think as a modern writer we would have phrased that differently. We would have emphasized both of those things. We would have said it's possible to have a life with love and a family, and, you know, to care for your aged parents, and also to be able to fulfill the thing that is your dream. And so writing a historical book, it's about finding those strands and finding those very modern female voices. And women at the time are a lot, in sort of 1900s, they are a lot more modern than I think people give them credit for. There's a wonderful American writer who wrote poems saying things, you know, why don't women's clothes have pockets in them? These are debates that are still, you know, modern women are still complaining about this 100 years later.
Yeah, and I have to say, I really, really enjoyed it. I don't know how you guys felt about it, but you brought these different perspectives and modern perspectives into different voices inside the novel. So we have 3 characters. Yep. They're all different from each other. It's Evelyn, and it's May and Nell, and they come from different social backgrounds and from different ideas, and they end up in different situations at the end, what you just said. You know, one is getting married, but then the marriage of Evelyn doesn't look like maybe as she imagined it to be. And also you bring in all these kind of relevant subjects, what you just said. 100 years ago, women were already very modern, and we still discuss stuff like that today. But before we go maybe more into detail of talking about the characters, you can read us a passage, like a part of the book, and it's about Evelyn, I think, when she's meeting up with the suffragettes. That's the first thing we hear about.
Yeah, I think it's a slightly longer passage than I read in Britain. Yeah. Was it
46?
46. 46?
Isn't it?
Was it? Yeah, no, yes, it could be the whole pack. Sorry, in Britain, you wouldn't read for longer than about 4 minutes, whereas in Germany, you are
we're listening to
longer. Okay, so this chapter is called Sandwiches. Evelyn's local suffragette group held meetings every Thursday evening. Evelyn had been along to one of these and found it rather dispiriting, like the dullest sort of committee meeting. Much more interested in minutes and organising and dividing up the mundane work of newspaper selling and shop staffing and handbell distributing than in slashing paintings in the National Gallery and setting off petrol bombs. Evelyn had hoped for a revolutionary cadre, and to Teddy's great relief, had found something much more like a mothers' union organising committee. She had, however, agreed to take a slot selling the Suffragette on street corners. I thought Saturday morning would be best, she said to Teddy. On the high street, or maybe outside the church. Somewhere where lots of mother's friends will see me. Evelyn had not told her parents about the Suffragettes. She was hoping they'd find out in the most public and dramatic way possible. Perhaps I could sing, she said thoughtfully. Or shout revolutionary slogans. Do you think one shouts? What exactly do you think is going to happen when your parents find out about this? Said Teddy, amused despite himself. It's hardly going to help you get to Oxford, is it? Evelyn flushed. I don't know, she said, and I don't care. They subjugated me and they've ruined my life, and they damn well ought to know it. But selling copies of the Suffragette on street corners proved rather distressing. Most people hurried past without buying anything. Some were openly scornful and combative, including a middle-aged lady who told her very plainly that a woman's concern should be her husband and children, not politics. One or two pointed and jeered. A young man in horn-rimmed spectacles told her that giving the women the vote would be a disaster, because 1 week out of every 4, women were biologically incapable of rational thought. This was rather a shocking thing for a strange man to say, and for a moment, Evelyn was blindsided. Then she told him furiously that that meant 3 weeks out of every 4 they were capable, which was more than could be said for men. Several tried to interest her in their own pet campaigns. Evelyn had to listen for nearly 20 minutes to an elderly gentleman from a temperance society, who clearly saw her as a tame subject for conversion. After he'd finally left, he'd been replaced by a woman who explained that suffragettes were all very well, though she didn't have time for that sort of thing herself. But what was really important was the poor little heathen children in Africa. And would Evelyn like a pamphlet, since she was here? You see, the thing was, Evelyn also had to deal with 2 men wanting directions, a young lady wanting to know the time, and an elderly lady who told her at great length about her granddaughter, who was just Evelyn's age and was having such difficulties. She hadn't even seen anyone she knew, except a couple of girls from school who had stared. What was the point of being publicly humiliated if you couldn't annoy your parents while you did so? Desperate measures were obviously necessary. So, a month later, she signed up to walk around Hampstead wearing a sandwich board advertising the next suffragette rally in Hyde Park. If that didn't attract her parents' attention, she felt, nothing would. The ladies of the West Hampstead Franchise Society assembled on Saturday morning in the suffrage shop, feeling somewhat daunted. Evelyn was wearing a white muslin party dress with a Votes for Women rosette affixed to her soldier. All of the ladies were wearing sandwich boards of the type worn to advertise closing down sales and final reductions, and were carrying leaflets advertising a rally, protesting the fact that the Free Irish were still allowed to campaign in Hyde Park while the suffragettes had been banned. There were 11 ladies present, including Evelyn, Miss Wilkinson, and Miss Collier, a young English teacher who had never done anything more daring than try to sell copies of the Suffragette in the street, and retire in confusion when a sign painter asked why she thought she should have a vote when he didn't. Miss Collier was studying herself with some alarm in the little mirror on the lid of her powder compact. Evelyn rather sympathised. Fortunately for Miss Collier, the mirror was too small to show the true horror of her predicament. "I feel like a belted knight," said Miss Wilkinson, in a tone of some amusement. "If anyone knocks me over, I'm going to have to lie flat on my back until someone picks me up." "I feel like a character in a pantomime," said Miss Collier. She peered at herself anxiously in the glass. "I do wish we hadn't got to do this in Hampstead. It's so much easier to be plucky when you don't have to worry about bumping into the neighbours." "I shouldn't worry," said Miss Wilkinson dryly. "I doubt any of the neighbours would recognise us in this get-up." Miss Collier brightened momentarily, then paled as she remembered the worst fates had awaited a suffragette than being recognised by the neighbours. "They won't throw things, will they?" she said. "They might," said one of the other women. "But you needn't worry about stones. They never throw them hard enough to matter. And you soon get used to mud. It's the rubbish I mind. Rotten vegetables and apple cores and banana skins and all that sort of thing." "Oh," said Miss Collier. She and Evelyn exchanged a worried glance. The ladies of the West Hampstead Franchise Society marched down the street with an air of controlled terror. To Evelyn's disappointment and mild amusement, their one aim seemed to be to finish their route as quickly as possible, preferably before anybody they knew recognised them. All were armed with handbills, and a few even managed to thrust one in the face of the more obvious gawkers. Miss Wilkinson, in fact, actually approached several passers-by with a smile and a cheery, "Votes for women?" But in this she was alone. The sight of 11 ladies dressed in sandwich boards was enough to cause comment at best and outright ridicule, and rotten vegetables at worst. A young man selling newspapers on the corner yelled, "You ought to be ashamed of yourselves!" Miss Wilkinson stopped and turned majestically to face him, nearly causing Miss Preddle, who was behind her, to walk into her wooden front. "Oh, Lord," said Miss Preddle. "I don't see," she said to the newspaper seller, "what I have to be ashamed of." The newspaper seller was clearly rather taken aback by this direct attack. "No," he said, "but see here. Why should women have the vote? They don't pay taxes." "Certainly they do," said Miss Wilkinson. "I myself am a schoolmistress. I pay taxes. Perhaps you think I shouldn't. In which case, I'd be delighted if you'd pass on that opinion to the government. I'm sure they'd be interested to hear your thoughts." There was some laughter and a few ironical cheers from a butcher's boy on a bicycle, who had slowed to listen. The newspaper seller scratched his chin and made the best of a bad situation. "No, but," he said, "men go to war, don't they? They die for their country. Women don't." "Some men go to war," said Miss Wilkinson, "and some do not." Her expression made it very clear which sort of man she thought the newspaper seller was. "And under our current system, those who do not vote. And women, who risk their lives every time they bring a child into the world, also do not. As far as I can tell, risking your life for your country rather loses you your right to vote than otherwise." Evelyn was rather impressed with this piece of logic. A man could only vote in an election if he'd been resident in the country for the previous year, which naturally ruled out most of the armed forces. A small crowd was gathering. Miss Wilkinson looked around to acknowledge the few scattered cheers that greeted this last sally, and gestured to the other suffragettes to start giving out handbills. Miss Collier said, in the tones of one about to face a firing squad, "I do believe that woman there has a little boy in my Sunday school." "She'll hardly recognise you guyed up like this," said Miss Preddle encouragingly. Miss Collier sighed and turned to a very grubby little girl in a white smock lugging a baby. "Would you like a handbill?" she said hopefully. "Coo," said the little girl. "Oi," said the butcher's boy, who was evidently growing bored. "Suffragette!" Miss Collier turned, and the boy lobbed half a fish paste sandwich at her. It hit her left cheek, and the boy hooted, while his friends cheered. The woman with the little boy in Miss Collier's Sunday school looked scandalised and hurried away. Miss Collier pulled out her handkerchief, wiped her face, and sighed. "Goodness," she said. "It's all very well, sacrificing yourself for your cause, but I do think men have it easier. At least people cheer when you go off to fight in the wars. I think I'd rather be blown up than have people throw things at me in the street." Evelyn thought she rather agreed. This was not the glamorous outlaw life she had hoped for. "I think we should set fire to things," she said darkly. "At least if you're setting fire to deserted manor houses, you don't have to deal with frightful missionary women and butcher's boys throwing sandwiches. Just witches and attics and hunchback recluses," Miss Collier agreed. "And spiders." "Hunchback recluses," said Evelyn, "would be no problem at all."
Thank you so much. Oh, yes, that's fine. Wonderful. So we have a really good insight into Evelyn as a character here who goes out with the suffragette, and we hear that the suffragette sometimes use violence to protest for the vote right, but also you kind of plumb the depth of the character by showing that there are also some insecurities and fears of the women when they want to get connected with the ideas and go out, but also they fear that what people might think of them, or if they get arrested. And Evelyn also says, I think at other little place where she says, oh, maybe I'm getting arrested. What does it really mean when I go to prison? So we have both sides of being courageous and standing up for an idea, and also being a little bit fearful. So how did you research the character, and how important was it for you to show these different insights of a person? Also, maybe the second question is, you show a little bit of civil disobedience there.
Yeah.
You know, that's an idea of protesting the government and protesting the law. And how difficult is it still to put these ideas into young adult books and say, look, you don't have to obey if you don't want to? I mean, there is this famous essay by Thoreau saying, really you have to think about your moral standpoint. That's more important than obeying a government, maybe, or laws you don't agree on. So how difficult is it to put these ideas in a character like Evelyn, and showing her kind of little debate with herself inside?
Well, I mean, my editors were fine with it. They didn't have a problem. None of the librarians I've dealt with had a problem. The only issue I've had is I once went into a school to do a talk, and they asked me to sign a piece of paper saying that I wasn't going to be promoting terrorism, or it was a general. They have a thing in Britain called British values. It was a general thing. You're not going to be, supporting law breaking or supporting terrorism, or And I kind of said, well, I am. Like, that's what my talk is about. I'm talking about the suffragettes, and they sort of didn't quite know what to do with that. They sort of went, oh no, the suffragettes are fine. It's just like terrorism nowadays. And I was like, well, they kind of were terrorists in a way. I mean, they did blow up buildings. They had a rule that you were supposed to damage property and not human lives. So the aim was that you would blow up buildings that didn't have people in them. But occasionally there were people in there, and there was one incident where they were wanting to blow up a theatre, which would have had people in it, but that they were stopped before that happened. I mean, it's a very diverse group with differing opinions, and you do have some people who are wanting more violence than other people. As a general rule, the rule was damage to property, not to people. But yeah, there was, they did set fire to things and things like that. I sort of eventually had to write something like, I will be doing this, but only historical violence. But generally, nobody else has had much of a problem with it. I mean, for a historical novel, I always try to read as much as I can that is written at the time. So that scene that I've just read was inspired by a writer called Evelyn Sharp, who Evelyn in the book is named after, who is a great hero of mine, because she was a children's author and a suffragette, and a journalist. She went to prison and went on hunger strike, and she wrote a lot about the suffrage. She wrote this wonderful book of essays, which is available for free on the internet if anybody's interested, which is just covering just sort of experiences like this, saying that actually, these are ordinary women who have lived very respectable lives for the most of the suffragettes were in Britain, at least. Again, I'm not so clear on the situation in Germany, but in Britain, most of the suffragettes were very white, very middle-class women, educated women, a lot of school teachers and wives and professions like that. She wrote. Evelyn Sharp wrote these wonderful books about these very sort of refined ladies being expected to walk through the streets in sandwich boards and have rotten fruit thrown at them. So I drew a lot on that. For the prison scenes, the most useful bit of research was Sylvia Pankhurst. Again, I'm not sure how much these are known names in Germany.
Probably not to everyone, all of them. I mean, some of you might have looked things up while reading the book on Wikipedia or somewhere, and but I think also in the book you kind of tell us a little bit about the background. So I think we know.
In Britain, there were two very distinct. I mean, there were hundreds of little suffrage societies, but there were two very distinct parts of the movement. There was the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, which was Millicent Fawcett, and then there was the Women's Social and Political Union, which was a woman called Emmeline Pankhurst. And most of the women were not suffragettes, they were suffragists. And the suffragists were much more peaceful. They had marches, they had rallies, they had public meetings, they would stand on street corners and talk on street corners, they had newspapers, they wrote articles in newspapers, they signed petitions, but it was a peaceful movement. They were not interested in violence, and that was Millicent Fawcett. And they were, there were literally thousands more of them than the Women's Social and Political Union. The Women's Social and Political Union were much smaller, but they are much more famous because Emmeline Pankhurst said we should have deeds, not words. And she was the one who was going around setting fire to buildings and smashing windows and trying to break into the Houses of Commons and doing all the things that you will have heard of associated with the suffragettes, who are much more famous, at least in Britain, than the suffragists. So Sylvia Pankhurst was Emmeline's daughter, and she had something of a rocky relationship with her mother. And she was a socialist, and she was concerned with getting working women involved in the campaign because she said these are issues that will impact on their lives to a much greater extent than middle-class women. A lot of working-class women worked, and you would be paid in Britain around half what a man will be paid for doing the same work. And that's not just for the same hourly work. If you, the character in my book, Nell, is a packer, so she packs a box with jam, and she's paid half per packed box what a man is paid for packing exactly the same box. And obviously this has an impact on how much money she brings home. Sorry, I've sort of gone off topic here a bit, but Sylvia Pankhurst wrote several autobiographies, and she wrote a description of what it was like to go on hunger strike and what it was like to be force-fed, which are genuinely one of the most harrowing things I've ever read. I mean, when I wrote the book, it's interesting when you start to write something, how your idea of it changes. When I wrote the book, I had thought of hunger strike as perhaps being something empowering. That Evelyn is the girl in the book who goes on hunger strike, and she's 17 and she has very little power over her life. And I thought that hunger strike would be a way of getting back some control for her. I'd sort of thought in my head that it would be a positive experience, that she would be able to take back this power. And then I read Sylvia's description and realised that this isn't a positive experience. This is a form of torture, and because the suffragettes, it's not just hunger strike; it's hunger and thirst strike. So they don't drink and they don't eat, and they would sometimes last up to a week in prison. And in 1913, the British government introduced something called the it was the Temporary Discharge of Prisoners for Medical Relief Act, which the suffragettes called the Cat and Mouse Act. A woman would be released and would be given a week or so to recover, and then she would be rearrested and expected to go back on hunger strike again. And it's not until you sit down and try and write what that must have been like to be tortured for. I mean, it's not, I say to be tortured is a bit grand because this is something that Evelyn has chosen, but to experience something which is used as a method of torture for a week, and then to be released for a week and to recover, and then to be recaptured and put back in prison. So I guess a mixture of reading as much as I could that was written at the time by people who were there and experienced this, and the process of writing it and the process of realising what hopefully getting a sense of what that might have been like.
Yeah, absolutely. So all these influences came into the different characters, and time is flying by. I was just about to ask a bit more about Nell, who you just mentioned. Because for me, she's one of the. I really loved her. She was my favorite character. In the book.
Excellent.
But maybe we get to that later, because I want to. Time is flying by. I want to have the chance to. No, that's fine. Absolutely, it's great. But we want to hear some questions later from the audience. So I would like to ask you to read another little passage out of the book, and then we open the floor for more questions.
So is that even Teddy, the next one?
That I have like 115.
150. Yeah, I should have got the notes for which ones I said. Oh yes, here we are. This is an ordinary member of the public. So this is the moment where Evelyn decides Evelyn's is sort of the most conventional storyline in the book, which is where you get a bit more of her. The other two characters are a bit more unconventional. This is the moment where Evelyn has decided that she's going to be arrested. An ordinary member of the public. Mrs. Layton's action was a simple one. 3 members of Parliament were speaking at an open meeting at a public hall in Camden. Several of the suffragettes had purchased tickets and would enter as ordinary audience members. Such actions were common enough that policemen were likely to be guarding the entrance. However, Mrs. Layton did not foresee any problems. "It's astonishing," she said, "how easy it is to disguise oneself as an ordinary member of the public when one is an ordinary member of the public, you know. If we all looked like the Harridans in newspaper cartoons, we'd have a far harder job of it." Partway through the meeting, these women would stand up and demand whether or not the members of the Parliament supported women's suffrage. They would continue to press the question until they were evicted. Meanwhile, their supporters, including Evelyn, would be gathering on the pavement outside. When the dignitaries left the building, the suffragettes would do all they could to bypass the police, reach the MPs, and continue their demands. They were to do so, Evelyn was instructed, until they were arrested. This all sounded straightforward enough, but it quickly got worse. Once convicted, all of the women would be expected to begin hunger and thirst strike immediately. Evelyn would have to refuse to eat or drink until she was too weak to stay safely in prison. Then she would be released for a week on license to recover, after which she would be rearrested and would have to start the whole thing again. She would keep on doing this until she had served her entire prison term. "It's a lot to ask," Mrs. Layton said, holding her teacup and a slice of Madeira cake, while Evelyn tried desperately to look as though they were discussing the weather. "Take some time to think about it, perhaps, and let me know." "I don't need time to think about it," said Evelyn. Other ladies were moving forward to talk to Mrs. Layton. Evelyn squared her shoulders, moved aside, and went to look for Teddy. He was waiting on a chair in the hallway, pretending to read the newspaper. Evelyn, remembering her father's jibes about her ignorance, glanced at the front page, but it didn't look very interesting. "Heir to Austrian throne murdered in Sarajevo," the headline said. She wondered vaguely why any English person was supposed to care what happened to Austria. Teddy clearly didn't. He shot up as she came through the door, grabbed her by the wrist, and pulled her into the morning room. She said, "Ow!" And then, "Teddy, get off me, can't you? That hurt!" His face was tight and furious. "You volunteered," he said, "haven't you?" And then, when she didn't answer, "Haven't you?" "So what if I have?" she said, a little sulkily. He dropped her wrist. "Evelyn!" "Evelyn what?" She faced him. "What are you going to do about it? Forbid me from going? You couldn't be such a scab as to tell my father." "Oh, couldn't I, though? What sort of a fellow doesn't tell a chap when his daughter, his schoolgirl daughter, is about to get herself flung into jail? It's hardly cricket, is it?" She said despairingly, "You beast! Is that how you think of me? As a schoolgirl, well, he had the grace to look awkward. I mean, not exactly, but... And I suppose you think it's your job to protect me and revere me and keep me in my proper sphere and all that bosh. It's my job to tell you when you're being a bloody fool, he said, pushed at last to his limit. You think this is all some sort of game, holy martyrs and whatnot, but you know what happens to martyrs, don't you? They get roasted at Tyburn. Haven't you seen enough of this mess already to know what it's going to be like? The policeman, the cell, the feeding tube. They don't use the feeding tube anymore, actually, she said. He looked for a moment as though he were going to strike her. She was suddenly very tired. All right, she said, fine, I won't go. Evelyn, I said I won't go. There, is your blasted honour satisfied now? Get out of my way. Of course you're going to go, he said. He wasn't arguing. He was stating a fact. She'd hoped he might have had the sense to leave it. I don't believe what I do or don't do is any business of yours, she said. In fact, I believe my parents have expressly forbidden you to have any contact with me whatsoever. Perhaps I should tell my father what use you had for that little edict. Or wouldn't that be cricket? Evelyn, for God's sake, this is serious. She rather wished she had accepted his bally marriage proposal. She would have liked an engagement ring to throw at his feet. Have you only just realised that, she said. How quaint the human male is. And before he could think up a response, she'd gone.
Thank you, Sally. And now we have another 10 minutes left, so I would really love to hear questions from the audience, and we open up the floor here a little bit. I think you were asked to write down questions on little pieces of paper, is that right? Then let's see what you just, here's a question, does the name Evelyn have a special meaning to you?
Yes, again, I talked a little bit about that. You want names. When you're writing this sort of book, you want names that are evocative of the period. And also, I am a great admirer of Evelyn Sharp, who made me laugh a lot when I was doing very boring suffragette research. So, yeah, she's inspired by Evelyn Sharp.
And also a good question that can follow up on what we just heard is, when did you start to get more interested in feminism? So maybe with the book or even before, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, definitely before. I think this is a really interesting period of history, because these women and their parents were Victorians. Is that a word that makes, yeah, Victorians who were living these very restricted lives, and their daughters were, women of the 1930s, 1940s, who were, going off and living lives that were much more modern. Having careers and lives outside the home and that sort of thing. And this is the generation where that change happens. And if you read something that talked a bit about Anne Veronica, and also talked a little bit about Little Women and things like that, a lot of the women in these books are ready for it. They are waiting for it. They are wanting a life that's not. Anne Veronica says, I don't want to get married at 17. I want to have a career. I want to go to university. And there's a sense that the young people are something you guys may feel, around kind of ideas of social change. At the moment, that the young people are ready for this world that doesn't quite exist yet. And the older generation are sort of saying, oh, no, we don't believe that, or we don't think this is worthwhile. I mean, you can see it around ideas like climate change. The young people are saying, why are we still discussing this? Why are we not acting? And the older generation are kind of, and the government, and maybe even more the governments are taking a bit longer to catch up with the mood of the people. So that's, I guess, why this feminism particularly. I mean, I think feminism is still an issue that everybody in this room should be concerned with. I was talking, we were talking just before the fray about lockdown, and I talked a bit in my speech about how lockdown has affected me as a parent, and I mean my husband and I we everything was equal we had this is why we had this schedule that we would do one day and then we would swap, so we did the same day again, and we were determined that we would have the same amount of time, but that's quite unusual. They did a study of submissions to academic papers, and they found that men's submissions had risen over lockdown because they had nothing else to do with their time, and women's had just dropped off a cliff because they were the ones who were taking on the work of the household and the work of the childcare. And I mean, obviously, some women are single parents and things like that, and it gets a bit more complicated. But this is an issue that will directly affect every single one of you in this room, whether you choose to have children or not. The weight that is given to a woman's voice, your likelihood of women winning prizes or getting promoted. Rapes in Britain, I think it's only something like 3% of rapes result in a conviction. That's something you should take very seriously. In Russia, they've recently announced that it's now legal to hit your wife again. I mean, women are something like 10 times more likely in Britain to be the main carer for a child. I mean, these are the sort of figures that are accepted as part of their lives, but they are things that will go on to have a drastic impact on your lives, men and women, as you get. Men are more likely to commit suicide. Men are less likely to seek help for medical conditions, for psychiatric problems. Men are more likely to be lonely. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which this impacts us all. So yeah, I think it's absolutely a real and an important issue that we should all be involved in. And I'm not kidding when I say marry a feminist. Like, this is important.
Yeah, absolutely agreed upon. This is really going on. Time is still running, but I think I have two really interesting questions which also follow up on girlhood, womanhood, and what the roles are, maybe gender roles we can even push and have more diversity out here today, and what women and girls can be encouraged by. And so one question is that Nell's reads to me a little bit like trans, if I get this right here. And the question is, did you intend that? Or what does it mean for her relationships? And also maybe connected with what we just heard, here's a question asking, what is the most important thing women and girls should stand up?
Right, yes. Nell is a character in the book we haven't had a chance to talk about much, who is coded very masculinely. She wears male clothes, and yeah, I mean, I think maybe nowadays she would have been a trans person. I'm not sure if she would have been a man or if she would have been sort of a non-binary character. This was quite a difficult thing to write about in the book, because those weren't really concepts that existed in Edwardian Britain. And Nell she's the working class character. She comes from a very restrictive background. So, I mean, she finds the idea of kissing a girl even is quite, that takes her quite a while. She has a relationship with another girl in the book, May. There were a lot of lesbians involved in the suffrage movement. Christabel Pankhurst, who was Sylvia Pankhurst's sister, was at least bisexual. Annie Kenney, who's another prominent suffragette, was at least bisexual. I mean, these are women who had a bit more freedom in their lives and also had a vested interest in women being able to support themselves without a man. So, I mean, that was a very. I mean, Nell is referred to as she in the book because that isn't transgenderism isn't a concept that is available to her, and she has, I was thinking about this, she has quite a complex relationship with gender, because on the one hand, she very much rejects the notion of gender that society is expecting of. I mean, this is one of the things I was interested in, people having these set roles that they're expected to follow. You know, she doesn't want to get married. She certainly doesn't want to get married to a man. She's sexually attracted to women. She doesn't want to have children. She doesn't want to be a housewife. But she also the strongest and most positive relationships that she has are with women. She's very welcomed by the suffrage movement. She wants to have a relationship with women. So I do feel a bit bad calling her she, because I'm not sure that she would use she if she had been born now. But I'm not sure if she'd been born now, she wouldn't have been quite the same person that she is as a result of growing up in Edwardian Britain. And I don't think, I'm not sure even if that concept was available to her, whether she would have owned it for herself or not. I think it's something that would have been, she's a very private person, and she's got a lot of working through to do. She's had a very loving upbringing, but in a very kind of rigid world. She grows up in 2 rooms in a family of 8. She leaves school at 14 to get a job. She's expected to be involved in supporting her family. And I think even if she were to make that decision to call herself he or they, maybe, I think probably she would have gone for they rather than he. That wouldn't be the decision that she would make at 14. That would be something that would take longer for her. And it's not something that I felt could be addressed explicitly in a book that was set in 1914, because that vocabulary wasn't there. There were people who lived in genders that weren't the gender they were born. One of the books I read, I know I keep talking about books that I read, but this is a book that is when you write historical fiction, you take on so much from other books. It's called research, but it's really stealing. One of the books I read was The Well of Loneliness, which is a very famous queer text. It's about a character called Stephen, she's born a girl and she's referred to as she throughout the book, but she's christened Stephen because her parents wanted a boy, and she ends up becoming a lesbian, and she's an ambulance driver during the First World War, and she lives in Paris. And Radcliffe Hall, who wrote the book, referred to herself as John for her life. I don't think she lived as a man. I think she lived as a woman. She wore women's clothes and things like that, and she would have called herself she as well. But there were definite questionings around. It's a difficult subject to write, and I hope any trans people in the room don't feel like I've done it wrong, because I think Nell, I think, is one of the characters who hasn't really got a sense of who she is yet at the end. You get the sense, I got the sense with Nell, I don't know if this comes across, that she's beginning a journey and she hasn't got there yet. She's still living with her parents at the end of the book. She's still kind of, no, she's not living with her parents. She's living in a boarding house, but it's a very feminine boarding house. A young woman, a young working class woman wouldn't be living on her own until she got in a position where she earned a bit more money. So she's somebody who's still at the beginning of that journey, and I don't think she's got the vocabulary that she might have had now to kind of make those decisions. But I hope people don't feel like it was a mistake to call her she. It's tricky. This is a very emotive issue. But I'm interested in that. One of the things the book is about is this sense of being given. All the characters in the book are living in a very kind of Victorian, with very kind of Victorian expectations, and These are about people who don't want to be this. So there is
absolutely great, and we see there's so much more to explore and actually talk about identity politics and historical backgrounds. And I just want to thank, because the time is up, and I have wonderful composed questions here, and I want to thank everyone who wrote some down about Sylvia Pankhurst, but you explored on that before, so I think we heard something about that, also about if you like the ending of the book, but that's something maybe to ask you when you sign the books and give signatures. And so
do I like the ending of the book?
Yeah, very good. Me too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a messy ending. It is a messy ending, but it's not.
But it's also an outlook for what can come. But Nell and May say, well, we make the history, so they know that they're really important in it.
These are characters beginning their lives, and there is a lot of life that they've got left to live. And this is what happens when you write about people who are adolescent. I mean, Evelyn isn't adolescent by the end of the book, but yeah, they are still at the beginning of their lives, and they are still incredibly messy people with incredibly a lot of messy stuff to kind of work out. And that's, right, what happens next if you're interested?
Maybe we have the chance to ask more of this when you go out in a little bit in little groups, and you will sign novels outside. So there's a table. But first of all, thank you for coming today and coming up with the questions and listening. And especially thank you, Sally, for coming out to Berlin and opening the festival today. It was an honor and a pleasure to be with you today. And again, help me to applaud Sally for having a wonderful conversation.